Israel is a vibrant democracy. The question at hand now on judicial reform is what the balance of the democracy is, not if there's going to be or not going to be democracy. And at the end of the day, it is, as a proud Israeli, it is very important to speak loudly and confidently about our rights and our responsibilities as the democratic nation state of the Jewish people, and also hold our adversaries to account when that, and when we're called upon to do that. And definitely, and I agree with Talia on this point, stand up for freedom, stand up for democracy. And I'm proud to say, from my standpoint, that Israel has done under these circumstances, which is not easy. Israel's not known a day of peace since the day it was reestablished in 1948. It's done a very good job. It continues to do a job, and the fight will go on. And if everyone has civil discussions as we've had, I think we'll be in very good shape going forward.
How much should we care about what the world thinks about us? Why have this panel? Dan, why don't you start?
Thanks, Maayan. Back in 1955, March 29th to be specific, 1955, David Ben-Gurion, first prime minister, said, shmum, the famous expression, which means the UN, who cares? He continued to say, responding to accusations that he shouldn't invade Gaza following massive terror attacks against the Negev, it's less important what the nations, or he called the Goyim, say than what the Jews do. Well, 63 years later, the world situation has completely changed. And if you watch NBC News these months, they're talking about the Nazi moment of Kanye West in the United States. Israel and the Jewish people are under unprecedented assault. Their very legitimacy, their very right to exist in secure and defensible borders. And therefore, it's extremely important what is said about Israel, and even more important, what does Israel say about itself and about its adversaries? And just to finish up this point, we've seen very violent rhetoric in Israel over recent issues, whether it's judicial reform, whether it's the issue of apartheid and the Palestinian issue, which we hear in Israel. And if Israel delegitimizes itself, criminalizes itself by using language that its harshest enemies used against it, well, that unfortunately will inflame anti-Semitism abroad and will increase Israel's isolation in international organizations. So Israel should be careful about its rhetoric and be very vigilant about what its enemies are saying about it.
This government, as it was getting elected, and certainly right after it was elected, there were a couple of names that showed up in all the headlines around the world. I'm sure you know who they are. They are now Minister of National Security Itamar Ben-Gvir and Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich. Having them in the government, how does that impact the way Israel is perceived abroad?
When we Israelis on international television, at the Jerusalem Post Democracy 2023 conference, refer to ourselves in a democratically free and fair election as having fascist government ministers, I think we tread on very dangerous ground. Fascist is a term we all remember from probably the greatest act of mass murder in human history. Fascist is the word that Yasser Arafat used in his 1968 Palestinian National Charter. Fascist is the word that Ahmed Shkeri used in 1961 at the United Nations when he was the Saudi representative and then the founder of the PLO and the first establisher of the 1964 Palestinian Charter. Fascist is a word that Hezbollah, Iran, and our worst enemies use against us. So if we begin to adopt their nomenclature, it is no doubt why there are thousands and thousands of Israeli and Jewish students around the United States who are hiding under their desks and taking off any signs of being Jewish and understanding the worst spike in anti-Semitism since the Second World War. We have to be careful about self-delegitimization, political annihilation. This is simply extremely dangerous territory. Can you imagine for a moment if the Israeli government chose not to sit with democratic elected officials of any of its democratic allies, beginning with the United States, and there were senior officials that were very unpleasant and unpopular to many Israeli officials. A democratic election in a free and fair democratic society is the will of the people. And if we begin to play with that principle, boy, oh boy, are we moving into self-annihilation territory. The most important thing is, yes, self-criticism is very important. Talia wrote an important report back in 2005, appointed by Prime Minister Sharon, you did not get involved in invective. You spoke about policy. And it's very important for Israel to check what they called Bedek Bite, its own regulating what they called outposts at that time, unauthorized become authorized, not building on private land, et cetera, et cetera. Very important. The problem we face is that we deal in self-criticism as a democracy, but it very quickly bleeds into anti-Semitism. The line is very, very thin. When we talk about ourselves or when other people talk about us, they have to do so from the point of view of policy critique stripped away of hyperbole in historic context, in the context of our diplomatic rights, in the context of our legal rights, which there are, and unfortunately, as international attorney, former advisor to the Foreign Ministry, Alan Baker, has written extensively, that all too frequently transforms from clean criticism that weighs Israel's rights versus its responsibilities into these buzzwords like OPT, occupied Palestinian territory, imperialism, colonialism, apartheid, genocide. We hear this language all over the place. And Israel has not done a great job, to put it mildly, nor has the Jewish leadership in the United States to stand up against this type of annihilationist language. That is the major threat of the day. And by the way, its source is the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority has, as a matter of its strategy, advance this type of a nihilist nomenclature to drive a wedge between Israel and the diaspora. And one has to admit that Mahmoud Abbas, when he says 50 Holocausts, when he says that we infect Palestinians with corona, when Prime Minister Shtaya says that we play with Palestinian body parts and that we poison the wells, these are all millennia-old blood libels, and we have to be very clear about what we're facing in the international community, and not to engage in this type of self-annihilation. Many of those 100,000 people join the other 5 million Israelis in talking about the difficulties, problems, and obstacles of the current Supreme Court setup. The problem in Israel is that it's such a hyper-politicized society that we ran to critique the solution before we discussed what there is wide, quite broad consensus on, which is that we have a major problem with with a Supreme Court that has, in the minds of many, and including former Professor Ruth Gaveston and Justice Posner in the United States, had become a second sovereign elite in Israel. Now, without mentioning what the solution is, because there's legitimate criticism of this solution and that solution, I admit. But it's very important in Israel, and that people understand abroad, that we are facing a need for reform that is a matter of wide consensus in Israel. And I think that should be the point of reference for our discussion, not what this solution or that solution must be, but that people in protesting in Tel Aviv have also themselves said there's a problem with the way the Supreme Court is set up, is extremely activist, the way Israel talked about it before 1992. And that's the point of reference that we should be discussing. We have to give moral agency to our neighbors, the Palestinian Authority. And this is very important. The Palestinian Authority, at 30 years of Oslo, has advanced a policy of what I call rhetorical annihilationism, pay to slay. They pay as a line item in their international budget, incentive money, annuities, to kill Jewish civilians and Israeli civilians, not only Jews. They applied to the ICC without any authorization. They're not a state actor. They have mobilized these courts, weaponized these courts against Israel. And it's very important to understand that in 2023, it is time for Israel and its friends abroad to hold the Palestinian Authority accountable. Now, that's not to deny points that Tali made. It's not to deny at all, but it is to enlarge the strategic aperture of the conversation, because for 30 years, Israeli governments and many abroad have given the Palestinian Authority a pass. And it is time that they be held to the same standard as other actors, certainly as Israel is, and that has not been the case. It cannot be that Israel is being told that when it holds 138 million shekels and of monies to the Palestinian Authority, that actively engages in some of the worst terror financing in modern history and gives it to the terror victims, that then Israel becomes guilty somehow of not advancing the peace process.